Hey, welcome back to Bandwagon fans. This is Jeff, and today I'm going to be talking about a documentary produced locally here in Tucson called How Are the Children? Before I start actually talking about the film, I just want to go ahead and invite everybody to subscribe to the channel and hit that like button if you want to see more content like this. Also, feel free to leave your comments below. I have a feeling that for people that actually watch this video, it might actually stir up some things that you want to talk about, and I'd really like to hear what you have to say about the film and about the subject of the film itself, and of course your review, your critique of my critique. So with that being said, we're gonna go ahead and watch some of the trailer so you can actually get an idea of the film that I'm talking about. So here is the trailer for How Are the Children?
To be clear, something is happening in America.
Yeah, we had on December 7th of 2017, a shooting at our high school.
When I would talk to kids, they had lost the sparkle out of their eyes. They didn't have any dreams anymore.
Lots of drug abuse, alcohol abuse among many families.
More and more young people are thinking about attempting or actually dying by suicide. Right now, 1 out of 2 of America's children will have a mental, emotional, or behavioral disorder by age 18.
The reality is we talk about the issues of drugs and alcohol. We talk about the issues of suicide. We can't dance around them.
So how do we deal with those issues? How do we educate our children?
And what we've discovered from all of this work with the good behavior game, tested with many different options, when you do these procedures with young people in school, it changes their entire lifetime trajectory. We've had the science for more than 50 years. The only question is, will we use that science to protect our children and our futures?
All right, so that was the trailer for How Are the Children? And before I really start getting into the meat of this video, I want to just talk a little bit about the difference between a film of something and that thing. So in this case, we have a documentary about something, and you could have a discussion about just the documentary, how well the documentary was done, how well the film was done, how well it was edited, shot, audio quality, the script. So there's a discussion about the film, and then there's a separate discussion about the subject itself that the film covers. In this case, I'm going to kind of break it up. I'm going to talk about the film first, and I'm just going to talk about the film itself, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about the subject of the film. So, How Are the Children? This is a documentary produced locally here in Tucson, directed by Christopher Boladaris. I got to see a screening of it last night at a small theater here in town called the Screening Room. Screening Room often shows like classic films or art house films, and is often rented out for screenings such as this. And the primary subject of the documentary is Dr. Dennis Embry, I'm not sure, so I didn't look, so he's the owner of Paxis Institute, and they sell a program for childhood development that is implemented in schools that helps deal with child's behavior. The program itself is called the PAX program. It also goes by the Good Behavior Game. And this is a program that goes back to the 1960s, I believe, is when it was first developed. And then Dr. Embry, who has been working in childhood development since the 1960s, but didn't really get involved with the Good Behavior Game until after the Columbine shootings in 1999. So as far as the film itself goes, this is I would call it a pretty low budget documentary, and I completely can sympathize with all the struggles of trying to do any kind of film work without a budget. This channel itself has a budget of $0 because it has a revenue of $0. And what I will say, despite a couple little nitpicks of the film itself, the Christopher Boladeras did a really good job. He clearly knows what he's doing and made the most of the budget that he did. The vast majority of the film, probably 50 to 60% of the film, is just interviews with Dr. Dennis Embry. And then there's some footage of classrooms, of actually seeing a little bit of the PACS program in class, and some interviews with teachers and administrators in New Mexico. And then there's a couple scenes that are recreations, and then all these are edited together for the film. So overall, it was a pretty polished film. And if I had produced that, I'd be like showing it to everybody and really proud of that work. So anything I say here isn't really meant to diminish what they achieved, because it is for what they have, they were actually able to create a pretty good documentary. There's a couple audio issues that probably only a couple people noticed, but I did notice. But overall, the quality of the film was pretty strong. If as far as the film itself goes, a couple issues I had. One was the topic was not really clear. I wasn't sure if the documentary was about the plight of children in modern society. Was it a documentary about Dr. Dennis Embry? Was it about the PACS program? Was it about teenage suicide or gun violence? All of these things were in the film, but it was hard to hang my hat on saying this is a movie about this topic. And I think that, which brings up the second issue I had with it, and that was in the editing. Because the topic itself wasn't really clear, some of the editing was done in a way that made connections. It's reasonable for the audience member to make connections that probably weren't actually there. So, for example, early on in the film, Dr. Embry is talking, and he's bringing up the example of the polio vaccine, which I think he said by 1963 the polio virus had been eradicated in the world. They immediately cut to saying, for 50 years we've had the proven science of childhood development and behavior, and we know how to correct certain things. Well, because those two things are sequentially right next to each other, the inference is, well, we had the science for polio, and it's the same science for this childhood development program, at least in the film. In the Q&A session afterwards, somebody was asking a question about the science or the research behind the PACS program, and he specifically mentioned that the research on the PACS program in the good behavior game goes back 50 years. The research on the good behavior game was going back 50 years. So he clarified that point in person, but the film itself made it sound like it was the same research for the polio vaccine was supporting the good behavior game, and that's not exactly the case. There's a couple other examples where the recreations, the reenactments, one was a girl committing suicide, and then there was a reenactment of a young man doing a drug deal and getting arrested. And the inference is that the PACS program or the good behavior game, if they had been exposed to that, these bad things wouldn't have happened. I mean, that's a reasonable inference the way that the movie is structured, but I'm skeptical if those claims were actually being made or not, or if those claims actually could be substantiated if those claims were being made. So there's some issues with the editing that actually made it unclear exactly what the topic was and what the relationship between these disparate topics were. So probably the biggest issue I had with the movie overall, with the documentary overall. It also overall it had the feeling of being an infomercial. Now during the Q&A session, I was able to ask Christopher about that, what distinguished his documentary from being an infomercial. And I was particularly concerned that they had credited Dr. Embry as an executive producer. However, they clarified that Dr. Embry had no creative control over the film. They really only listed him as a producer, kind of as a thank you to him, but he had no control over the script, he had no control over the editing, and no control over the film itself. So that alleviated some of my concern, but it still, watching the whole video, it still felt like it felt more like promoting a particular product rather than a documentary about a certain topic. For those of you that actually get to watch this video, get to watch How Are the Children, you might disagree with me on that, but that was my perspective, and I'm going to stick with it. But overall, like I said a few minutes ago, if I made that documentary, I'd be very proud of my work. So they definitely can be proud of what they accomplished. And in the Q&A session, they said that they're going to be shopping it around to different festivals, and I think that they might get some success with it. Although I think the target audience is more geared towards administrators and teachers to sell the PACS program. So I'm going to kind of wrap up the discussion of the film itself, and now I'm going to go into a discussion about the PACS program, Dr. Dennis Embry, and the Good Behavior game. I'm going to try to limit it to what was in the documentary itself and not anything external to that video. So I'm going to start off by saying that, full disclaimer, whatever I say here isn't I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Coming out of the documentary, I had some concerns with the claims that were being made by Dr. Embry, but if what he's doing is better than alternatives, then more power to him, and I hope his program is able to succeed. So I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, and one of my favorite sayings is, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. I think there might be some issues with his claims, but again, if the program works, then hopefully it spreads and it's beneficial to more and more children. So one of the issues I have with the way that this PACS program was being presented was the specific claims were vague, but also kind of grandiose. So for example, during the Q&A session, Dr. Embry mentioned a couple times that he's trying to save the world. And that's a pretty ambitious claim for a program that just modifies children's behaviors, particularly young children's behavior. And with that being said, let me talk a little bit about what the program actually is. And you could actually go back to one of the issues I had with the film. The film never really established this is the PACS program. They talked a lot around it, but never really said this is the program, this is its goals, this is what it can achieve. But it looks like what I gather that this is a program meant to augment childhood education. It's not a lesson in and of itself. It's a system of rewards so that can be implemented during anything else the children are doing. So whether they're walking down the hallway, going from one class to another, whether they're in a math class, at lunch, it's a system of reinforcing good behavior and positive cooperative strategies. So it could be implemented at any stage of childhood development and in any kind of scenario. And if that sounds kind of vague, I apologize, but it was really hard to get a clear grasp of exactly what the program was just from the documentary. So and that kind of feeds into kind of these vague claims. Like I never really got a sense of this is what the PACS program can achieve, other than Dr. Embry is trying to save the world. There was a statistic that they used in the film a couple times and in the Q&A afterwards, where Dr. Embry said that 1 out of 2 kids will have a mental condition before the age of 18. Now that sounds big, scary number, 50% with a mental condition, but no real context for what that statistic means. Whether that's 1 in 2 kids are going to have PTSD or ADHD or autism or whether depression. So, there's mental health condition could cover a wide spectrum of issues. And so it's, when you start interspersing that statistic with showing teenagers committing suicide, teenagers, Columbine, somebody going to a school and teenagers shooting other kids, it kind of takes what would be maybe a small but significant problem and makes it seem like a much worse problem. There's a little bit of fear mongering going on there. Now it's not to say that mental health is not a significant issue, but it's hard to gauge just how significant it is based off of that one statistic out of context. Again, this goes back to some of the editing where the film was appearing to make connections that may or may not have been intended. Throughout the movie and in the Q&A afterwards, there was some mentions of this being the good behavior game being well studied and researched, but they didn't really go into what any of those studies were, or what the methodology of those studies were, or if they had been replicated. So one of the biggest issues in the social sciences of the last 10 years is what's called the crisis of replicability. There's a lot of studies that make specific claims about human behavior that when other researchers go to try to recreate those studies, they're unable to get the same results, which calls into question whether or not those initial results were ever valid to begin with. So again, within the context of this documentary, saying that there's studies that show that how successful this program is great, but if you don't tell us what those studies are, or what the methodology was, or whether or not those studies are replicable, it's kind of meaningless to me and in evaluating whether or not the effectiveness of that program. There's also an issue that I would have with this particular program, and this comes from the film and also the Q&A afterwards. Dr. Embry, even though he cited the 1 in 2 statistic of kids will have a mental condition before they're 18, he was adamant, particularly in the Q&A, in saying that it's not a problem with the kids themselves. It's a problem with the culture, with the society. And this is near and dear to my heart, the difference between a structural problem and an individual problem. A lot of times we say there's, crime is a good example. You can look at crime as an individual problem, as in this one person committed a crime. You could also look at it as a structural problem in terms of the society that produced the person that committed that crime. So the classic example, is it immoral to steal a loaf of bread if you're starving? You could look at it as the individual problem. Yes, this person is committing a crime, stealing something. Or you could look at it as a structural problem. The resources are being distributed in a manner where somebody would have to steal in order to survive. Dr. Embry was really adamant in the Q&A about looking at structural problems rather than individual problems. But the solution he's proposing through the good behavior game and his PACS project, at least what we see in the documentary, is all individual based. It's all about changing individual behavior. So, I'm a little skeptical of that process because it doesn't appear to address, if he's trying to make the claim that the good behavior game would prevent teen suicide, okay, what does the good behavior game do about social inequality, racism, structural inequality, and it almost feels like he's recreating. He mentioned a couple of times that what we have now is kind of an unnatural process, and I think he was referring to our education system and how we take kids away from their families, put them in a factory style education program, and that's just inherently unnatural, and it's causing kids to feel disconnected to a greater humanity, and it's this disconnect in a factory style education system that's causing all these problems such as teen suicide. But his program doesn't ultimately change that program. It just reforms the factory slightly. And so I'm a little skeptical about what actually can be achieved through this program, considering it doesn't seem to address any of the actual structural issues that are causing teen suicide, teen violence, etc. So another, kind of the last issue I want to address, and I don't remember, I believe this came up during the documentary itself briefly, but it definitely came up during the Q&A, and that was Dr. Embry referencing evolution and psychology, which so evolutionary psychology, and if I believe that's what he was referencing, basically saying that so evolutionary psychology is this idea that during the course of human evolution, we develop certain psychological traits or behaviors to deal with particular environments. And now, 150,000 years later, the environment has changed so much but we still carry those earlier psychological traits that are maladaptive for this current environment. Now, my background was originally in cultural anthropology, and as a cultural anthropologist, we are, oh, hey, Emmett, I'm not sure, yeah, well, you can just barely see him down there, but, oh, come here, guy. So, my background being in cultural anthropology, we are inherently skeptical of evolutionary psychology, and the reason being is the underlying premise of evolutionary psychology cannot be independently demonstrated, which leads to a situation where you can make any claim and say that the science backs it up, the quote-unquote science backs it up. So, for example, I can make a claim that people are inherently violent because 150,000 years ago we had to be aggressive and violent to deal with the harshness of the sub-Saharan plains. I could also make the claim that we're inherently cooperative and peaceful because we had to, 150,000 years ago on the African plains, learn how to cooperate with each other and be peaceful with each other to deal with the challenges of the environment. Both of those claims could be valid, but we have absolutely no way of going and verifying what the psychology of people were 150,000 years ago. So because the underlying premise can't be demonstrated, you can make just about any claim and say, well, it is because it is. It's the entire field is basically a tautology or circular reasoning, in which the evidence for the premise becomes, well, the premise becomes the evidence for itself. So when I start hearing people make claims rooted in evolutionary psychology, it just raises a red flag for me. However, I'm trying to remember during the Q&A if he really addressed that. Again, it might. I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. The one thing I'll absolutely say about Dr. Embry is Dr. Embry and the Good Behavior Game is his concern. His concern is genuine, and he is probably getting good results with the kids. So I'm not trying to dismiss the entire program. I'm just skeptical about exactly how broad the efficacy is. One of the things that happens when we start being critical of good people or good people trying to do good things, it often sounds like we're just trying to completely dismiss what the people are doing, or the people themselves. And I'm not trying to do that at all. But the documentary raised a lot of questions in my mind, and it'd be wonderful to actually be able to have actually been able to sit down and talk with them in a smaller setting. And maybe at some point, somebody from the film or Dr. Embry will actually watch this review, and they'll want to talk to me and tell me everything I got wrong in discussing the documentary. But the last thing I kind of want to talk about is just how I even got to go watch this film. I was actually going to go watch Happy Death Day to You last night. A friend of mine messaged me, said, hey, my friend her friend is actually in the video, in the documentary. Let's go check it out and support her. And I was like, cool. And that's one of the best things about why I started doing this channel, is just the opportunity to forcing myself to go out and do new things, see things I wouldn't otherwise see. So I'm really glad I got to watch this documentary. I'm glad I got to see the screening where there was a Q&A afterwards. And it just reminds me that every day across this country, there are people putting together documentaries, shooting films, recording a YouTube channel that 10 people are going to watch. There's just so many people out there grinding, trying to produce their art, their videos, documenting some little aspect of history, and it's worthwhile. Even if it's worthwhile to go out and try to find those things to watch them, continue to make them. I'm going to keep doing this channel. No matter how much I suck at it, I'm going to keep doing it. And I do applaud Christopher Boladeris for what he was able to achieve with the documentary. And even though I've spent the last 20 minutes being critical of Dr. Embry, I still applaud all of his efforts, and I hope he succeeds. It's just I tend to be a little skeptical, and I think I went through all the reasons why I'm skeptical. But I do think the program is probably going to be I do think the program is better than some of the other alternatives out there. So don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, and most importantly, go out and support your local art. If you hear that somebody is showing a film somewhere, if there's a local film festival, just go out and give it a try. It may not be that good. It may be the most amazing thing you've seen in the last year, but those guys are, and to some extent me, are just grinding, trying to get something out there and just trying to get better every day. So I'm going to kind of wrap it up. I'll have a link to the trailer for How Are the Children below, but at this time I'm not sure. Other than their private screenings, I'm not sure how you can actually go out and see this film, but hopefully you go out and get to watch it for yourself sometime, and then you'll see for yourself and say if I'm full of shit or not. So anyway, thanks again. I'm Jeff. This is Bandwagon Fans, and get on the bandwagon.